Namaskar, good morning. Welcome to GKGI conference. A very warm welcome. I'm Priya Tandon, the moderator. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to be part of an event which celebrates the life of global leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, Chavez, especially on the special occasion of 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, a historic moment for all of us, everyone in this world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Clay Carson, Dr. Prasad from India, Dr. Prasad from USA, and the entire team for organizing this conference and bringing us all together to witness this historic moment. I would like to especially thank the audience, very special guests in this room, and I truly appreciate them being present here. I'm honored and privileged to have a distinguished panel consisting of Johnny J. Mack, Mike Honey, Anthony Chavez, and Dr. Nandini Tandon. The topic today is Sarvodaya, economic justice and uplift to all. What an apt topic, especially for this time and for this very moment. The distinguished panels will thread us through the life and achievements of the distinguished global leaders, and they will do so through discussion, through music, through dialogue, and through slides, making it very interesting and exciting for the audience. The panelists and we had a discussion and realized that there was so much that these people had achieved. How do we bring it together in just an hour and a half? And then we realized that Johnny, Anthony, and Mike will discuss the life of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Mr. Chavez, and Nandini will summarize all of that with the vision of Mahatma Gandhi, what it stood, the similarities between the world leaders. And after that, we will open the conference to the audience for question and answers, and look forward to a fun, amazing conference. With that, please help me invite Johnny J. Mack to the podium. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya, and good morning to everyone. I only have 15 minutes, and I was saying to Anthony, I get warmed up. It takes 15 minutes just to get warmed up, and I've already wasted 15 seconds of that. There is so much to say on this subject, and I'm so delighted to be here at Stanford. And I echo your thanks of the many from Dr. Carson to so many others who have made this possible. It's so nice to see friends and colleagues that I've worked with in one way or another over the years. My task this morning is in 15 short minutes to discuss we don't want to do that. To discuss Dr. King, principally, but as well, is that working, everyone? But as well, Gandhi and Chavez. Said differently, to discuss nonviolence and how three giants of the idea, principally from the 20th century, thought about and used the logic of nonviolence. I'd like to challenge you to think a bit differently about what you might understand nonviolence to be. I have 50 slides here and won't get through them. So as I speak, I'm going to jump around, and somewhere you'll find where I am on the slides. At one point, I will actually, I think, point out some key parts of my discussion on the slides. The issue here is to challenge once again your thinking about King, particularly, but Gandhi and Chavez as well, and the many champions, particularly in the 20th century, of nonviolence, and what they were doing, what they were thinking, and why. In Dr. King's case, we think about his dream, and we talk about that dream too often in the abstract, not completely appreciating what King was actually trying to say, what he was actually trying to do. I like to talk about King's logic of nonviolence as a now not yet theory. A now not yet theory. King is always wrestling with the now, how to improve the quality of life of individuals in the global community right now, because of the exigencies and the immediacies of simply living in a world of chaos. At the same time, King understood that the now was confronted with what I like to call the not yet. That is, his dream was about a world not yet realized. And his challenge was, to all of us, creating that not yet. One then is a transactional idea of nonviolence, and the other is a transformational idea of nonviolence. If you were here last night, you might have heard Martin Luther King III, Dr. King's son, speak about a culture of nonviolence. And the question comes, how do we human beings create a culture of nonviolence? I would argue that this is the puzzle, this is the project of Dr. Martin Luther King's work, understanding how in the immediacy of the moment to address the compelling issues of life's chances and changes, and at the same time creating the social structure, what King called the social edifice. Remember, he talks about an edifice that needs restructuring. And so, as we think about this framework, I would propose that nonviolence is more than resistance. How we use and think about and apply nonviolence is a direct notion, it is a structural notion, and it is a cultural notion. If you think about those terms, then you might recognize they follow a framework of violence. And if you're familiar with Johan Galton's work, for example, he talks about conflict and violence and a framework of violence that is direct, structural, and cultural. Priya, I want to make sure I'm okay on time. So the question then becomes, how do we understand what King is trying to do with this transactional, transformational, now not yet logic as he tries to make positive social change, not only in the US, but globally? So our problem becomes, I think I know where I am in these slides. What are these forms of nonviolence and how can we understand them? One way of doing it is to think about a theoretical setting. I would argue that the champions of nonviolence in the 20th century in terms of a theoretical framework, are three. They include Martin Luther King Jr. Well, first, Mohandas K. Gandhi, of course, the father of nonviolence. Then, secondly, Martin Luther King Jr., who adopted, of course, and adapted Gandhiji's framework of nonviolence to the particular U.S. experience. And then there's Gene Sharp. Many of you, probably most of you in this room, are familiar with his work. I would argue that King, Gandhi, and Sharp each approach nonviolence in different ways. Gandhi with an emphasis on the moral framework, I would argue, of nonviolence. Sharp on a more practical, pragmatic framework of nonviolence. And then King is in the middle, a more conscientiousness, a combination of the moral and the pragmatic. I usually do this kind of discussion over a day or two or three, and I can't go into all of those details, but hopefully by the time my next 6 or 7 minutes are finished, you will have gotten the idea. In addition to King, Gandhi, and Sharp, there are others who have written extensively about nonviolence. I've already mentioned Galtong, and then there's Etienne Balibar and Paulo Freire. These are important ideas, I think, important thinkers about this framework of nonviolence that help to understand particularly what King was doing. So careful reflection on the work and writings of King and of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement gives us an understanding of his nonviolence. King is constantly and always concerned about social change and human development. He is concerned about how human beings organize themselves as societies, and societies as communities, communities as groups, and individuals as they interact with one another. And so King talks about the World House. In 1968, his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos to Community. I believe it's the 6th chapter. It's a chapter, if you're interested in King, you cannot miss, and you must read and reread. It captures, I think, the essence of King's logic of nonviolence. In that chapter, we find that King is talking about humanity, and within humanity, he addresses the issues of change and development. He addresses issues of conflict and violence and nonviolence and peace. King argues that true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is understanding that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. What is he talking about? What is this edifice that needs restructuring? He builds on this as he thinks about change and development in the social edifice by arguing that we must have a revolution of values. And that revolution of values occurs through peaceable power. And that peaceable power is effected through ethical dimensions, an ethical framework. And so there's an ethics of nonviolence, a values framework of nonviolence that King is concerned about. Going back to the social edifice, we understand that society, and I argue King understands society, is built upon a basic framework of the state, the market, and the civic sector, where the state is its role and its purpose is to organize social order and reproduction of that social order. Everybody still with me? The market is about goods and services and production, producing the products of life within the social framework. And then there's the civic sector. Oh my. And then there's the civic sector and the association and deliberation and ideation. Ideation here being It is up to civil society to build the framework, to inform and instruct the other two sectors. King comes to understand, I can't wait for you to come to my next workshop because you'll want to hear the rest of this. King came to understand that it's civil society that has the monopoly on non-violence. We argue that the state has the monopoly on violence, right? That is one of the definitions and understandings of the state. Civil society, King came to understand, has the monopoly on nonviolence. The problem is civil society doesn't know it. Think about that. And if we could think about nonviolence more than mere, and this is not to minimize the importance of nonviolent resistance and direct action, but nonviolence is more than direct action. It is a social, cultural framework that requires each of those three in order to effect the changing of the social edifice. My 2 minutes are up I'm going to have to stop there. Perhaps we can pick this up in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Civil society has the monopoly on nonviolence. What a powerful thought. Now may I now invite Mike Honey. Thank you.
So first of all, I have to plug in order to plug us in. I think, let's see. Is that the right one? So I usually do this just because it helps my head. Might help you too. In a panel so fraught with so much to cover, and for the weekend, so much to cover, I'd like you to help me sing a song. This takes us back to the highlight of the civil rights movement, and this is how most people, if they're thinking of the civil rights movement, they're thinking of this. And then I'm going to take it from there to somewhere else. Play from current slide. So if you know call and response, you'll know this one. Ain't no harm to keep your mind. My mind it was stayed on freedom. Ain't no harm to keep your mind. My mind it was stayed on freedom. That's stay and stayed. Ain't no harm to keep your mind. My mind it was stayed on freedom. Here's the really easy part. Hallelujah. 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 Oh, walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind. My mind, it was a state on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Oops. I said walk, 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 walk with your mind on freedom. Talk, 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 talk with your mind on freedom. Oh, 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 walk, talk. I said we shall not, you know that we shall not be moved. I think you probably know this. Oh, we shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the water. We shall not be moved. He shall be removed. He shall be removed, just like a pail of garbage in the alley. He shall be removed. You don't sound convincing at all. He shall be removed. He shall be removed, just like a pail of garbage in the alley. He shall be removed. Okay. So I'm going to pick up where Johnny left off, I think, more or less. Yeah, you gotta, at a conference like this, you have to sing a little bit. I know we got lots of singing tonight. So I'm going to take you to a different sort of framework for King, but not so different. His framework of economic justice, which is sort of our panel, Uplift of all. To move toward what he called the promised land in his last speech on earth. And then the question is, well, what was the promised land? And we have a way of thinking about King. At least King is remembered because Coretta and all the other people did such a great job of getting a national holiday. So he is remembered, but how is he remembered is the struggle historians and other people, movement people, are having. And I wrote this book trying to pinpoint that. It's called To the Promised Land. There's some flyers out there on the table. And James Lawson hit it on the head. And we have a film on James Lawson at 1:30, and there's a flyer about that out there also. More than 50 years since Memphis, how should King be remembered? Lawson said, an advocate of nonviolence has made a major decision and a major analysis about violence that's all-encompassing, seeing life's cruelty systems, which is what Jim calls it, as interrelated parts of the same problem. Failing in how we remember King, he said, is our typing him as a civil rights leader. That allows conventional minds across the country to thereby stereotype him and eliminate him from an overall analysis of our society. Beyond King's dream of civil and voting rights lay a demand that every person have adequate food, education, housing, a decent job and income, and also beyond that, a more revolutionary quest for a nonviolent society beyond racism, poverty, and more, the same thing that Johnny was just talking about. So I'm just going to flash through a few elements of this idea. I found most of my material in the King Papers in Atlanta or at the King Papers here at Stanford. This is kind of a long quote, but the important part about it is one thing I learned in really studying King closely is that he talked about slavery a lot. And this doesn't usually make it into the King as civil rights leader framework, but the reality is on the Poor People's Campaign going through Mississippi, he was saying the reason we have the problem we have is because it goes back to slavery. And of course, his grandparents were slaves, great-grandparents, right? King, was it Clay was great-grandparents, were slaves. And so that is an economic formation and a racial formation. As a grandparent? Yeah, born in slavery, late and right before emancipation. So that's something that comes up a lot in the Poor People's Campaign when he's starting to try to frame this economic analysis. And another thing that comes up a lot is the role of black women. And he learns this, of course, in the Montgomery bus boycott, that women were the power for much of that boycott. And in most of the campaigns that he was in, women were the power at the grassroots. And you didn't see them up on the stage so much, but King knew that they were there and would turn to them frequently. And of course, we wouldn't have won the Montgomery bus boycott without the women. So I think I'll start right here play from this side. So one thing we do know, of course, is that King is basing his framework on Gandhi and also Howard Thurman and Black social gospel writing, which Clay wrote an article very early on that put it in this context of what is the black social gospel. And it's all the things that King talked about in the Poor People's Campaign: basic rights to food, housing, education, jobs, quality of life. And so King's Gandhian framework is also a black liberation framework from the very beginning. And it's got this economic base. How could it not? You know, as the country that's been through 250 years of slavery, another 100 years of slavery by another name, segregation, it's very much of it is about the economics of racism. So, of course, King would be very much on top of that. And this is at the King Center, where I was speaking about a year ago about the basic steps of nonviolence. And I think this afternoon when Jim Lawson talks, he's going to talk about the steps of nonviolence, the practical way. What I learned about King was growing up as a teenager in Michigan, far from the South. This is a rally in Detroit, the Walk to Freedom in 1963, before the March on Washington. The noticeable thing in Detroit was the huge numbers of working class people, many of them union members in the United Auto Workers. His connection with the Farm Workers Union, even though he and Cesar Chavez didn't meet, they knew what they were doing, and they were on two different coasts doing similar kinds of nonviolent campaigns. And then, you know, the campaigns, James Lawson told me, in Birmingham, every campaign had an economic dimension. It was never absent. It wasn't always just voting rights. It wasn't just the right to be able to use public accommodations, but to be hired in public accommodations. That was in the Nashville sit-in movement. It was in the Birmingham movement, and all the different campaigns. When King came back from getting the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway, he helped to lead a strike in Atlanta of 800 black women. And really through the intervention of SCLC, they won their strike. And at that time, he's speaking very much about union rights. And he was working with the United Packing House Workers in Chicago, 1199 in New York City, the International Longshore Workers on the West Coast, and many other unions. When I researched at the King Papers, I found this file. It said King's labor speeches. This was years ago, and I didn't know there were any labor speeches. There's tons of them. So I edited a book called All Labor Has Dignity, which is King's labor speeches. So all of these campaigns, I would argue, have this economic dimension. And really crucial is King's coalition building idea. So the nonviolence framework is not just the campaign, but it's the coalition that comes with the campaign. And this again is in Detroit, where I was. And down in Mississippi, Stokely Carmichael said that King was most at ease and happiest when he was with masses of people in places like Mississippi. And this is during the March Against Fear. And you can see it in the wonderful pictures that were taken. Bob Fitch, which Clay helped get those photographs into the Stanford archive, right? He has the most wonderful pictures of this. I got 2 minutes? And Joan Baez here. But, you know, during the Poor People's Campaign, King was campaigning in all these little towns all across the place. And this came out of the turn of events in 1967 and 66 and 67, where it became obvious that the economic issues were at the forefront, and that's why the cities were exploding everywhere, as well as police brutality and violence. And I grew up around Detroit, so that was one of the biggest riots of all time in the summer of 67. And then King also was a beleaguered person. The right wing, the more that King focused on the poverty, racism, and war theme, that these are all tied together, the more the right wing went after him. And there was a group called Breakthrough in Michigan that harassed him. And you can see this picture captures his kind of melancholy mood. This is just a couple of weeks before he's murdered. And then he ends up in Memphis in a strike. And it was not an aberration that he ended up in Memphis, because he had been speaking about this all along as part of all his union campaigning. Let's see if I can get one. Have I got time for 1 minute? 1 minute? Half a minute? All right, maybe I'll skip it. It's a speech that King made to the sanitation workers. The I Am a Man placard, you know, has become famous in Memphis, and for good reason. It was about human dignity above all. James Lawson was one of the key leaders in that. And the National Guard came in. It had all the same dynamics as a civil rights campaign, except it was a union campaign with civil rights support. After Dr. King died, people understood the connection. Union justice now, honor King, and racism. And unions all over the country supported. And the Poor People's Campaign did go on after King was killed, led pretty much by women, by Coretta and the Welfare Rights Organization. And here you see UAW, strongest supporter of it, and massive demonstrations in Memphis and other places. And Coretta going on to work with the strike in South Carolina of women hospital workers, and with the Boycott Grapes. This is Coretta with Dolores Huerta. There's Cesar Chavez. Okay, my thing is telling me to shut up. Okay, so just to finish with this in half a minute, this is where I come into the picture as a student organizer with Students for Democratic Society, and then going down south as a conscientious objector against war, and ending up in this jail in southern Kentucky for 3 weeks with no showers. And so I got inaugurated into civil rights and labor scholarship by working in the movement for 6 years. And that's a whole nother story, but it was a time of massive repression. It was very much like now, only it was Richard Nixon who was the one who was shutting us down. And this is a picture taken by Ernest Withers, who turned out to be an FBI operative that we didn't know about. We thought he was our friend. And so it went. This is the Wilmington 10 case and South African embassy. But the way union people remember King is they remember him in this framework. It's very strong in the labor movement today. And most people maybe don't quite get it, but people in the labor movement do get it. And 50 years since King, this is what people did in Memphis. And you saw union people from all over the country coming to Memphis. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that soulful song and a very inspiring talk. May I now invite Anthony Chavez to kindly share his thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning. And once again, thank you, Dr. Carson, and thank you to all of our wonderful patrons that made this weekend possible. It's a real honor to be here and to be sharing with all of you. What I want to do in my kind of opening 10 minutes is talk about my grandfather's core values and where that came from, a little bit about his formation as a young person before we knew him as the social justice, human rights activist who led the farm workers movement with Dolores Huerta and so many others and more. And I think I want to do that in particular because I feel like my grandfather probably remains one of the less well-known, figures here this weekend. So this is also just an opportunity to maybe enlighten you to some things about my grandfather that you may not be aware of. I guess it should be noted that this perspective is certainly coming from the perspective of a descendant. By no means am I an academic. I was a student of philosophy and religious studies, so I think that's one of the things that draws me in the most. But really a lot of this is based on what I saw from my grandfather and really much more about what I heard from him after he passed away while growing up in the movement and the community that he helped build. And one of the things that I came to witness was that deep sense of faith that shaped my tata and the movement, my tata, my grandfather, and the movement that he led. And much of that came from his family's devout Catholicism and Mexican spirituality that was instilled in him by his mother, much like Gandhi and his mother, who taught him that cultural framework of nonviolence as a Jain. It was my great-great-grandmother, Juana Chavez, who was a curandera, or a practitioner of Mexican folk healing. And I think there were three key elements that came through growing up in that household with his parents. And those very basic tenets are the tenets of compassion, nonviolence, and social justice. The stories of compassion are about them as young, poor, farm-working family migrating to California after they lost their family farm. And it was often my grandfather and his brother Richard who would go out and who would look for hobos or other single traveling folks and would invite them into their tent to have a small bean taco, what little bit they could share. It was my grandmother, Juana, who reminded him in their consejos, or their truisms, or their axioms, that it takes two to fight and one can't do it alone, and reminded him about the importance of, always turning that cheek. And it probably didn't call it nonviolence then, but that's where those basic tenets came from. And similarly, that spirit for social justice also came from his mother, who was the first to jump out there whenever there was an injustice against farm workers, who would, join the picket line, but who would also call out the managers on the field who would try to shortchange workers by rigging the scales and by not paying them their full due. And I think that's where my grandfather, again, took those very basic tenets. And then later on, as he was growing up as a young man, that's how he began to view the events that had transpired over his lifetime. So as I mentioned, it's how he looked back at his family losing their small farm on the tail end of the Depression. And it's also how he thought about the injustices that were endured by migrant farm workers here in the Central Valley of California and beyond. That's why he didn't accept the discrimination and the prejudice against the migrant workers. Jim Crow bigotry wasn't just only found in the South, it was also found right here in California. As we heard, where we grew up, Juanita was saying, it's often been referred to as, the Alabama of California, if you will. And those lessons are also why he didn't accept the discrimination and prejudice while serving in the U.S. Navy just on the tail end of World War II. This was before President Truman had desegregated the armed services. And so the Navy reserved the most menial jobs for Latinos and African Americans, things like washing the deck and working in the kitchen. And it's very funny to look back and to hear that my grandfather talked about his time in the Navy as being one of the worst times of his life, and yet to come fast forward to a couple years back when actually the Navy decided to honor my grandfather by naming a ship after him. As my grandfather was on his way out to join the troops in his small little hometown of Delano, he faced some of that Jim Crow racism and bigotry when he and my grandmother, his girlfriend at the time, Helen, were kicked out of a movie theater for sitting in a whites-only section. And at that time, the ACLU had actually approached my grandfather about taking up that case to challenge segregation, but he was shipped out overseas before that case could be taken up. And so when my grandfather returned home from World War II, like many other veterans, he realized that the fight for equality, peace, and justice wasn't just abroad, it was also right at home. And so my grandfather applied those life lessons to what he learned from Gandhi about economic justice, and I think more importantly about moral jujitsu. So if you go to the National Chavez Historic Site just outside of Bakersfield, California, where I grew up, there you'll see my grandfather's office as he left it the day he passed away. And from floor to ceiling, he has bookshelves on all 3 of his walls. He probably read more books than I've ever read as someone who was fortunate enough to go to college. And even though he only had what basically amounted to an 8th grade education, he was completely self-taught. But there you'll find the complete works of Gandhi in dog ears with all kinds of notes on the side. And he read them all, including the account of the 1930 salt boycott. He also carefully followed Dr. King's Montgomery bus boycott in the mid-50s and his movement. And my tata agreed wholeheartedly with Gandhi that it doesn't take much intelligence at all to be violent. So nonviolence instead demanded the creativity and the ability to outthink and outwork his opponents. So when the Delano grape strike started in the 60s, you have to remember that the growers controlled all of the legal, political, social, and economic institutions in rural California, like the cops and the courts and everything in between. They even made it unconstitutional to use your First Amendment right to do picketing and protesting. They banned basic freedom of speech, and yet the strikers endured the humiliation that they took on a daily basis, and even the threats of violence on their lives, which took a toll on 5 different figures in the movement who are martyrs for standing up. But over time, eventually, the boycott of grapes and other products were allowed the farm workers to transfer the scene of the battle from the fields in Central Valley, rural California, to the cities. And that's really where they had the chance to take the upper hand. It's what my grandfather called the court of last resort, the moral conscience of America. And that's where they, really invited folks to think about the simple choices that they can make and the collective ramifications that could send to the growers, and to let them know that their abuse and their practices were unjust and would not be tolerated anymore by consumers. And so from that impetus of the grape boycott in the 1960s, that should be noted was started by Filipino farm workers, and I think was really one of the greatest testaments of a multi-ethnic and diverse coalition of U.S. civil rights, is something that still continues today. And I think that's actually quite unique. While there were many great movements that started in the 60s, there's very few that have had the continuity that the United Farm Workers have had for the last 50 years. And so it makes me very proud to be up here and to share a little bit of that history with you all. So thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing that very inspiring story of Cesar Chavez. Thank you so much once again. And I'd now like to invite Dr. Nandini Tandon to share the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi. Sometimes we wonder whether someone like Mahatma Gandhi ever walked on the streets of this world. Dr. Nandini Tandon, thank you.
Namaskar, good morning. What an honor and privilege to be here today on this historic occasion of celebrating legends of the world. It gives me goose pimples to think that we are all collected to think how they thought about uplifting the masses for economic justice and for Sarvodaya for all, which is even more apt today than it ever was, because we have such large population, so much wealth, so much technical artificial intelligence added to our own intelligence, and yet we are where these legends were struggling to ensure that there is human dignity and justice and economic justice for all. I too, like my fellow panelists, would like to pay a tribute to Professor Clay Carson for being the magnet, for being the one who's brought us all together, and for all the benefactors who have made this possible. We all know it takes a village, and that is one of the secret sauce that Professor Clay Carson has. He knows how to put a village together. So I wanted to thank you, Clay. I'm honored and privileged to be included in this gathering, and trust an elder sister to give you a tough task to follow three brilliant gentlemen talking about three legends, and ask me to provide a quintessence of where the commonality is between Gandhi and the other legends. I'll start with values. At the end of it all, it really is about values. Because we all protect and we all take care of that which we love and which we value. And unless our moral compass is not set right, it does not matter what action we are taking. And I think the greatest strength that Gandhi brought in an era where the sun would not set on the land of the British, when the British Empire was so incredibly strong that they were so powerful from 360 degrees of globality, and for Gandhi to stand up with his moral compass and say that no, you will not treat us as lesser individual, as lesser human beings, is, I think, the commonality that there is. It's not just the fact that he was shaken up by his experiences in Africa, but then he left Africa and in 1915 went back to India. So the other notion of think global but act local. And at this point, I'll also like to inject that I know Professor Carson is very modest and he will not talk about what he's doing, but while this conference is taking place, he's also putting together forces such that the movement goes forward in a thoughtful manner. And one of the things he's focusing on is exactly this. How do we think global but we act local? So he went back to his people, as did Cesar Chavez, as did Martin Luther King, went back among their own people and looked for solutions. The other thing is that you can be with the people, you can be a leader, you can take on the world, but if you don't have empathy, you really don't have the ability to think and feel and make a change happen. And one of the most powerful things that Gandhi brought was in that beautiful song that we heard yesterday, Vaishnav Jan ko tene kahiye, Peer parai jane hai. That the ultimate human being is the one who understands the pain of others. Not just our own pain, we all feel our own pain. But what Gandhiji brought to the forefront, we must feel the pain of others, which is again the part of the moral compass. And not only just feel the pain, but go beyond that, to serve them, to serve the bottom of the pyramid. That was very, very important in all his actions that he did. The other very, very powerful notion that every time when I travel different parts of the world, I'm told by many people that India has given non-violence to the world. What a spectacular, special gift that the Indian philosophy has given, and what an amazing ambassador in Gandhi to make sure that when the world had been wrecked by World War I, World War II, when violence was rearing its ugliest head, that he had the courage to say that you may have the armaments and the ammunitions, but what we have is the moral strength, which is more powerful than anything of nonviolence. The other thing that comes to mind is that is common between these legends is which Gandhi so beautifully said, especially in the context of economic justice that we have gathered today. That this world, the Mother Earth, produces abundance for all of us. The divinity, which Anthony Chavez so beautifully said, that all of these legends had the divinity's belief on their side, and they paid homage to divinity and took strength from whatever religion they had, Catholicism, Hinduism, whatever religion that they were revering to, that they took strength from that. All the religions believe that God does not let us down. There's abundance for everybody. And Gandhi beautifully said, there's enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. And I think that is the quintessence spirit that we must remember when we're looking for economic justice. This whole notion that in the media you're only cool when you have the latest Apple watch, and you're only cool when you're driving a certain kind of car, and you're on your nth wife who's looking like has just walked out of Hollywood. That whole notion of greed perpetuating and manifesting itself in so many different ways does not allow for us to rise above the dwarf within us, which is another very strong concept of Hinduism that Gandhi was trying to propagate. Nataraj, Shiva, is standing on a dwarf. And the whole notion is that the ultimate strength is within us, and the pettiest spirit is also within us. And we have to quell, we have to subjugate what is within us. So that it's, at the end of the day, the battle is within us to whom we want to be. Another thread that tied them all together is that individually we can think as lofty as we want. But if we really want to move the needle, it has to be gathering of everybody. And that's the other place where I would like to bring Clay's thoughts, where Clay has been working tirelessly to see how technology can play a critical role rather than being misused for taking privacy away from us, rather than being misused for being a platform for terrorism, or savagery being wreaked on the masses, how it can be used for, pardon my usage of the term, cloud computing, cloud gathering, cloud financing for individuals. Because here, the economic justice will only happen if we gather everybody. And the beauty of all the legends that we're talking about today is that they understood the strength is with the masses. So Gandhi chose salt. I mean, how much more basic does it get in everybody's kitchen as salt? And it is a salt march that he did, which allowed everybody to reverberate, resonate with him, and be behind him, and force the mightiest nation of Gandhiji's time to step back and take notice. Similarly, Charkha. The other thing which is so important is what all of them have said. Like Hillel, I know I'm bringing yet another element out here. I mean, Hillel said, if I'm not for myself, who is for me? Self-reliance. If I'm only for myself, what am I? And that is what all these legends did. Let's rise above our pettiness, our greed, and see what we can do for others. And what everybody said today, the sense of immediacy. You don't know what tomorrow holds for us. We don't even know we'll be there tomorrow. Priya and I just lost our father, who was a Gandhian, a freedom fighter, who loved meeting Professor Clay Carson. And we are poignantly reminded that tomorrow is not guaranteed. And that's what Hillel said. If not now, then when? And that's exactly what Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez are all pointing. That we need to take charge of the destiny today. Tomorrow is not guaranteed. I would like, before I'm reminded of the time, I'd like to share two other thoughts. You all know the Nobel laureate Tagore, who, when was given the Nobel Prize for his literature, refused to accept it in the Gandhian thought that I will not take this award as a slave. My country must be free. I must be a free man before I take the Nobel Prize. There's a beautiful saying in his poem, Gitanjali, and Gitanjali means the divine, the offering to the divinity. Says God's strength lies not as much in the thunderstorm as it lies in the gentle breeze. You referred to, Anthony, that it takes more intelligence to be patient, to be kind, to be compassionate. It takes more discretion to be a gentle breeze than to be a barbaric thunderstorm. And all of them stood for that. I know, Johnny, you started out by saying it has to be a revolution of ideas, and that was common to all. And Michael, you pointed to the fact that unless we bring everybody together, we don't have the strength. There were so many commonalities among all of them. I would like to end by saying that art is such an important mechanism to touch our soul. And the Gandhi, the movie, touched so many peoples all over the world. And there was a very poignant scene in that when Nehru goes to Gandhi and says that the masses are outside your prison and you have been pontificating. You have had paralysis through analysis. You're just waiting. You are not telling us where to go. You need to tell us, and we'll start moving. We are wasting time. And Gandhi said to Nehru, yes, we can move, but in what direction? And I think I would like to thank Clay for giving me this opportunity to be amongst all. I know Priya would like to work with you to see what direction the Sarvodaya, the uplift, and the economic justice will all take place. And with that, I thank you for my time.
Thank you, Nandini. Well, one gets speechless when we think about Gandhi. One gets speechless when we think about all the legends. Mike would like to have us sing a song.
At the very end.
So you can sing now, and then we like to open the podium for question and answers, if you have any. And please let us know who you are and who would you like the question to be directed to. Thank you.
My name is Jake Dorman, and I'm a former student of Dr. Carson's. I graduated 23 years ago now, and I'm a professor of history at UNR. So my question is, in a way, for all of you, all of these different struggles that Gandhi, King, and Cesar Chavez led were in some sense economic struggles. And I'm wondering if implied in going beyond that, if you could all speak to their larger criticism of capitalism as a system. I know Dr. Carson has uncovered, statements that King made that were very critical of capitalism. And I know that he was constrained in his own time about making those explicit. He was labeled, of course, a communist by Hoover and the FBI. But I'm also wondering how much we're constrained in our own world about, focusing explicitly on their explicit critique, not just of individual labor struggles, but of the capitalist system as a whole. And you could say similar things of Gandhi's critique of Britain, that Britain was subjugating India economically. And Cesar Chavez, of course, was on the front lines of some of the oppression in the American capitalist system. So this is a question for all of you about their larger meta-critique of the system, and how much do you think they were constrained in their time, and how much are we constrained in our time from?
Thank you.
Well, I happen to have a couple of King quotes with me. Clay and the King papers uncovered these letters between Coretta and Martin way back in 1952, and about King's thinking about capitalism at the time. But this is a few years later at Highlander Folk School. I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the tragic inequalities of an economic system that takes the necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. He kept doing that theme in almost all of his labor speeches, and because people in unions understood exactly what he was talking about. And then he also started using those kind of comments in the Poor People's Campaign. And toward the end, well, here's another one. The evil of war, the evil of economic injustice, and the evil of racial injustice are all together. This was at a National Union convention, or during his Nobel Prize speech. People everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I was just in Norway for visiting professor and went to Oslo and went to the Nobel Prize building and talked to the leader of it. It moved King a lot when he saw a society that actually was caring for its people. In Norway, you have paid family leave for a year. You have free college education. Students actually get paid to go to college. Union rights are given. All public employees belong to unions. 50% of private employees belong to unions. Women are justly compensated in ways that they aren't here. They have immigrants coming in who are breaking into that system as well. And this is the kind of thing that King foresaw. That's why Bernie Sanders calls him King a democratic socialist, and other people, Michael Harrington, who King knew very well, they talked about democratic socialism. And we know that comment from King, a radical redistribution of power must take place. Something is wrong with capitalism as it now exists. So he had that radical economic analysis all the way through. I think you can go back to Morehouse, actually, as an undergraduate, that he had that also. So this is not the kind of thing that they say on Martin Luther King Day, usually. But that's what we need to be talking about.
Thank you.
I would agree, obviously, that King's critique of capitalism was really central, I think, to his argument and his logic, as I like to call it, and others do, of nonviolence. But not it alone, as I sought to discuss in my few minutes. King has a whole framework of the social structure itself. It's not that capitalism itself is inherently bad. It is how human beings practice capitalism. It is the choices that we make. No system is inherently bad in itself. It is we human beings. And I think this is what King is really getting at. If you think about his 1967 Vietnam War speech at Riverside Church, he really captures the essence of his argument that poverty, racism, and militarism, the 3 evils, really capture his critique of capitalism and the whole social edifice. Now today, finally, we think about those terms and we miss, I think, an essential element of what King is saying. Remember, King is in the mid-20th century, and he's at the height of the Industrial Revolution. The height of the Industrial Revolution. We're no longer there. So what do poverty, racism, and militarism look like today? What is King really saying? It gets back to the underlying values that King was speaking about. Poverty is about cupidity, right? Poverty is about cupidity or greed. Racism is about bigotry, right? In all of its forms. And militarism is about rivalry, violent rivalry. So when we think about King's triple evils and we apply them to any social framework and the underlying values that structure the social edifice, it is bigotry, rivalry, and cupidity that undermine our human choices. And he wants to replace them with, I would argue, 3 other things: a certain civility and dignity, poverty, racism, and war, bigotry, rivalry, and what's my third one? Cupidity. He wants dignity. He wants civility. What's the third he wants? Community. Community.
Yeah, and if I may add, my grandfather certainly knew about the brutalities of cowboy capitalism and just the economic realities that imposed upon families. So you still have, nearly 500,000 kids who are working in the fields of America. It still remains one of the most deadly occupations. I think one of the ways that my grandfather challenged the norms of capitalism was that he heavily relied upon volunteerism to found his movement. And he realized that so many other attempts at organizing farm workers fell short when they ran out of money, and just like many other organizing campaigns. So we said we cannot allow, the strength of our movement to come from the resources of the money. It has to come from the volunteerism. I think the other thing that he took up and he really applied was this value of also communitarianism. And that's why he had to found his own small little commune, if you will, which is called Nuestra Señorina de la Paz, or La Paz as we know it in short, which is now the National Historic Chavez site. And that was how he was able to support, so many folks who took that leap of faith to go out in search of, the dignity and justice that they saw not only for themselves as farm workers, but for their children and future generations. I think kind of to Johnny's point about, the systems, well, I think there is some inherent evil in capitalism. However, it's also how we can adjust those systems and how we could align the incentives and the choices and consumers' motivation. So one of the things that the United Farm Workers have started to do today is, accept that they cannot organize farm workers in all of the farms across California, let alone the nation. But what they can try to do is organize the supply chains. And so just being mindful of what the consumer forces are, they're now trying to work to create what they call the Equitable Food Initiative, because they know that more and more consumers today want not only healthy, good tasting products, but they also want to know that they're conscientiously being produced. And so you hear it being discussed in the corporate sector as B corporations, the triple bottom line. And so they're really trying to, align those values too in the marketplace. So it's a different way of organizing that tries to pull in the reins where rampant capitalism, can trample us. See a question in the back?
I think
Oh, sorry.
That's an excellent question. I think that's an excellent question as to how Gandhi looked at capitalism. And I am no expert on either Gandhi's thoughts on capitalism, but as an Indian-born American citizen, having experienced what capitalism is in America and having grown up on the stories of my grandparents who were freedom fighters, who burned the clothes that had come from Britain or did things on their own, I think it's a complex answer, because I don't think Gandhi was against capitalism or socialism or communism. I think what Gandhi was for the people, whatever it takes for the people to succeed. And the other thing we have to remember, that the Gujaratis are very entrepreneurial. Even before the word entrepreneurship was coined, the Gujaratis were excelling in being entrepreneurs. So Gandhi was not advocating that the government take care of the people. So it's not like Gandhi said no to capitalism and yes to communism and socialism. I think what Gandhi was saying is that people have to rely that they have the ability to succeed on their own, and they have to rely without either the government giving the hands down or giving down to them, or them not realizing that they're being exploited by a handful of people, whether they are British or they're other forces. So in my mind, when I was growing up and I was learning about Gandhi, what would always reverberate is that for him, the most important thing is that we understand that the strength is within us and we rely on ourselves. And that doesn't fall into any of the bucket. It falls into the bucket of being strong, collecting people to be strong and working. And that even touches communism, socialism, capitalism. Thank you.
A very please. It's just about 5 minutes left and then 1 minute song.
So
yes.
people in Norway kept saying to me, and Denmark and Sweden, I went to all those places, they kept saying, when you go back to the US, tell people that we are a capitalist country. We're not a socialist country, but we have democratic socialism, or democratic, social democracy, sorry. The term they use is social democracy. And when King was there, he called it a third way between capitalism and communism. And I was really shocked living in Norway for 6 weeks to discover that you actually can have capitalism that is humane. The US is the outlier. I mean, we're the greatest outlier on this issue. So we don't have to make this choice like it's either one or the other thing. King said there, it's about values, as we've all been saying.
A brief question, please. Yes, please.
My name's Kirti Soni Selli, and I'm on the faculty at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And what brought me here is not necessarily the legacy of Gandhi, though I so appreciate your putting this particular conference together at this time. What brought me here is what I think is there's a fundamental need within my establishment. It's the largest university system in the country. We have 30,000 faculty.
So what is the question, please?
And we have, the shame of the academy is that we need a civil rights activity within the academy so that our students, who are now students of color largely and come from poor backgrounds, are given the education they need and offered the opportunity they need. But in fact, our own institutions have become institutions where we are 70% adjunctified. And I'm in the 30% privileged, and I am ashamed. My daily activity is not as a College of Business professor, though that's what my job is. It is to try and make change in the institutions. And so I'm very grateful to be here. It's more of a comment, and I know we'll have time at lunch and other places to have a conversation. But I'm here to learn, and I'm incredibly proud. I know, of course, you're speaking as the grandson of your grandfather, but of course, as far as I'm concerned, you're a product of our institution.
Thank you.
No, thank you, and I'm glad you brought that up. You know, public education is one of the most important things in a democratic society, and you know, when we look at the disinvestment of education, you know, we could also talk about the browning faces of our institutions, right, and the students who are being served. That's why I'm very proud to work at the Education Trust West. It's all about making our schools better for low-income students and students of color here in California. It's why we write reports like Black Minds Matter in the Majority Report, because Latino students are the majority of students in our California public schools. We can't no longer be thinking about students of color as minorities. They are the changing and browning face. And so, you know, you're right to ask those questions. Why the divestment, right, in our education at a time when the numbers of students of color in a more diverse, you know, society could really benefit from that robust investment in our schools is no longer there. So we're taking on those issues, trying to ensure that that whole pipeline of opportunity is available.
Thank you, thanks. Thank you, Anthony.
And if I could just add a quick thought about this. The whole notion of nonviolence as direct action, as I was saying earlier, is something that we have to examine collectively as a group. What are the other forms of action and activities that have to be examined? King talked about this. We have to look at other forms of nonviolent activity in order to make the institutional and structural changes that are necessary. And I don't think we, as a collective, in our consciousness about what nonviolence really means and how to make it a culture of behavior and how it is reflected in our institutional frameworks. If we had a nonviolent institutional framework in the California educational system, then we wouldn't have this problem. The system itself is violent. How do we change that? Do we march around Jericho wall, so to speak, the institutional framework? Is that what's going to change it? Or are there other forms of nonviolent practice? I think that is what we have to spend time taking a look at.
I can agree more. I think it all amounts to the values, and it's a manifestation of values, whether it's in the education system, or it's in capitalism, or it's in economic justice. It's all a question of what is the fountainhead of values out here.
Thank you.
And how do we inculcate them?
So we have just about few minutes, in fact 2 minutes, probably a minute. So Mike, would you like to briefly sing that song before I thank the audience, the panelists, and everybody?
So I think it's always good at a discussion like this to raise our voices together a little bit. So I picked up a song that I think really resonates with the time that we're in. This is a song from the Sea Islands of Georgia that Guy and Candy Caraway picked up to Highlander Folk School. Elway Jenkins, I think her name is, the singer, but it goes back to slavery, and it just asks a simple question, and has a little bit of an answer, and it reminds me of the people who are coming up from the border to try to get into the United States today. Ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right? So the call and response is, ain't you got a right? 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 To the tree of life, to the tree of life. Long was the journey, ain't you got a right? Hard was the journey, ain't you got a right? But we've got a right, ain't you got a right? To the tree of life, to the tree of life. We're a coat of many colors, ain't you got a right? All sisters and brothers, ain't you got a right? And we've got a right, ain't we got a right? To the tree of life, to the tree of life. Last time, ain't you got a right? 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 To the tree of life, to the tree of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as we come to the end of the session, this very spectacular session, and especially with 150 years of Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary, a moment in time in history, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, all the legends of the world, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their soul-searching discussion. I would like to thank the audience for being with us, for participating and contributing in the way best that you have done. And thank you so much once again. Thank you, Clay, for this amazing conference, the teamwork, and thanks once again for being part of this very important occasion. Thank you. Thank you so much.